I'm Jill Lawrence, and I'll be moderating this panel. And our panelists include Mr. Hoyer and Carmel Martin, the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress, and Jim Kessler, the Senior Vice President for Policy at Third Way. So we're going to have a discussion, and then following that, we'll be taking questions from you. And I'm going to address my first question to Carmel. We've had a speech here from Mr. Hoyer in which he wants to put the spotlight on long-term fiscal sustainability. CAP is arguing these days that it's time to put the spotlight somewhere else, that it's been misguided to focus on fiscal sustainability, and we ought to focus on the here and now and improving the economy in the short term, even if it costs money. So could you talk a little bit about the CAP position on that and why you think that perhaps this refocusing on fiscal discipline is not the way to go?
Sure. First, I just want to thank Third Way for having me today and the Congressman for his tremendous leadership on these issues. I think I am here as the voice of opposition, but the reality is I agree with just about everything that the Congressman said in his speech. But we do think at CAP that we still have a long-term debt problem that needs to be tackled at some point, but we think that it's time to put investments in the economy in front of that as a higher priority. The Congressman also called for investments in the economy, so it's not a point of disagreement. Perhaps it's just a differing view in terms of emphasis. The reason we think it's time to put the debt situation to the back seat of investments in economic growth is not because there isn't a manufactured debt crisis, as the Congressman laid out, we've seen over the last several years, but because the situation has changed. The facts on the ground have changed. We have, as the Congressman mentioned, we have gone from the deficits being close to 10% of a share of the economy to 3% of the share of the economy. In the next 3 years, we're expecting debt as a share of the economy to go down for the next 3 years. And we haven't fixed the problem. It still exists, and it needs to be tackled because we have a demographic problem with respect to things like Social Security and Medicare. But we've given ourselves some room to breathe, we think, to really focus on investments in economic growth. If you look at the latest CBO projections, deficits are down, debt's down, healthcare costs are down, but also, unfortunately, their revenue projections are down because they're saying that economic growth, they're changing the projections around economic growth. And we think the way to tackle that, it's not really a confidence issue, it's a demand issue. So we think in the short term what we need to focus on are exactly the things the Congressman mentioned: past immigration reform, extend unemployment insurance, invest in infrastructure. We also think we need to raise the minimum wage. And if we focus on those things, even if they're not without offsets, that is the way that we can help deal with the demand problem, bring economic growth back to the country. And then when the political context would allow for a big deal, which in our opinion doesn't exist at the moment, although the Congressman should be the expert on the political situation, not me. But when the time is right for a big deal, if we are able to inspire economic growth, it'll be an easier challenge to solve because we'll have hopefully increased demand, economic growth, increased revenues stemming from that.
Would you like to respond?
Sure, and I don't think this is a debate. I think that we have substantial agreement. I tell my members, you cannot solve America's problems in 24-month cycles. What do I mean by that? You can't solve America's challenges by simply thinking of the next election. I agree, and Simpson-Bowles agreed. Simpson-Bowles said we need to invest now, but have a plan for sustainability over the long run. So there is no conflict here. But we see increasingly, and my point was, the vulnerable are put at risk every year as we squeeze the discretionary side of the budget. And we squeeze the discretionary side of the budget because we don't have a confidence that we're going to have long-term sustainability. If we had a 10-year plan or a 15-year plan that saw us on a path to sustainability, then short-term increase in deficits to pump our economy to make sure the vulnerable in America are protected would, I think, be much more politically viable. So we agree. I agree. I agree with Simpson-Bowles. Simpson-Bowles agreed. We have brought down the deficit. Now, however, we spiked up the deficit very substantially as a result of the tax cuts and the deepest recession that any of us in this room have experienced. And we put $787 billion in stimulus, which I supported to grow the economy. It was perhaps not enough, and we need to continue to invest in education, innovation, infrastructure, and other things in our society, which will help grow our economy, which is the best way, of course, to bring down the debt.
Let me just bring Jim into this. One thing that you did not mention was Social Security, and that seems to be a real flashpoint in the Democratic Party these days. Third Way has taken on the role of trying to kind of quash this idea that maybe we need to increase Social Security benefits instead of ratchet them back as the baby boom goes into this, and we come to a point where it's not fiscally sustainable. And in fact, Jim here has written, along with Third Way, that this kind of populism is a fantasy and a disaster and a dead end.
Thanks for bringing it up.
And recently, I think what panicked you was that Elizabeth Warren came out for this, and suddenly it had a whole new level of credibility and potential. So here's my question. Doesn't this seem like a logical response in a situation where wages are stagnant or declining, pensions are disappearing, and people are very unnerved about what's going to happen in their retirement years?
Well, look, I think in an ideal world, I think it would be wonderful to give every single senior citizen an increase in their Social Security benefits, whether they put more into the system or not, which is what that plan does. Every single person who gets Social Security would get more. If you are someone who earns $80 or $90 or $110,000 a year, you would get about $40,000 more over the lifetime of your benefits without putting in another penny into the trust fund. That would be wonderful if we could afford it. We can't afford it. Our view on Social Security and all these entitlements is, look, I think there is a lot of agreement here. There's this real agreement that we need to invest more. We are really not doing nearly enough in terms of our kids, investing in our kids. It's not just the federal level, it's the state level too. You look at K-12 budgets over the last 30 years, they're flat in real terms. And infrastructure and research, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, there is this giant coming along that's devouring more and more of the budget, and it's these entitlement programs that are good, important programs. But they're really, in our view, is not a path to get more investments out there unless we're dealing with these entitlement programs, including Social Security. I think Social Security can be fixed in a way in which we protect middle-class people, and some other people are going to take a haircut and we're going to increase taxes. But I do think for Democrats, entitlements is our military-industrial complex that Ike had, which is, Ike was pro-defense and pro-military, but said, look, as a Republican, we've got to look at this. And I think as Democrats, we helped create this safety net, but we've got to look at it as well and see if there's ways that we compare some of these things back, because I do fear we're not investing in growth and investing in the future.
Looking back at your speeches, Mr. Hoyer, you seem to have been on sort of a continuum of 5 stages of debt grief. They all have similar messages but different tones. And you started off with optimism about the Deficit Commission and also harnessing the outrage of the Tea Party and other people about the deficit. And you've moved on to anger and then disappointment. And then you didn't give a speech at all last year. And this year, it looks like renewed resolve or something. I mean, what's happening up there on Capitol Hill? And what are the chances that you see of any kind of a grand bargain in the next couple of years?
I don't know about the next couple of years. I don't think there's going to be a grand bargain in the next couple of months, that's for sure. But I think, as I said, we ought not to miss opportunities. I don't know about my 5 stages of grief or anger or whatever. I've had continuing focus on this. And my speech this year is to simply say, look, and this may be where emphasis is the issue, not substance. We can't forget this. We can't wait for crisis. because in crisis we do worse things to the people that I think the Democratic Party really is designed to make sure have a quality of life and opportunity. And as a result, what I'm trying to do today is to focus us on the continuing need to reach a long-term fiscally sustainable policy, because if we don't, then I frankly think the priorities of my party and the priorities of our country are going to be deeply damaged.
Well, maybe you can help explain things that happen on Capitol Hill that don't seem explainable or comprehensible. For instance, I'm thinking about this whole idea of streamlining job training programs. President Obama has talked about this. Eric Cantor has talked about this. The House brought up a bill on this. Everybody seems to think, that there's something like 50 programs that are in different parts of the government. They all overlap. They're redundant. They need to be streamlined. And yet, you can't get from here to there, and Democrats largely voted against the proposal in the House. And this is something that everyone agrees needs to be done. So how do you explain to the American people, why is this not happening?
All right. You want me to explain the unexplainable? I don't think it's unexplainable.
In 25 words or less.
25 words or less. First of all, I think there is agreement, as you point out, that we need to make programs rational, coordinated, and effective. The difference comes when one side says we want to make these programs rational and reasonable and effective and cut resources. Because that's what happened, for instance, in the Skills Act, which I don't know whether that's the particular bill you're referring to, but my friend Mr. Cantor talks a lot about that. But what they wanted to do was cut the investments that were being made in achieving those objectives. So I think the difference is not so much in coordinating or simplifying or reducing numbers of programs, but the difference is in making them equally effective or more effective because the need is greater.
Okay.
I think that's where the difference comes.
What about immigration? What do you see happening with that?
Well, I think that almost everybody in the country is for comprehensive immigration reform except House Republicans. The Chamber of Commerce is for it. AFL-CIO is for it. Growers are for it. Farm workers are for it. Evangelicals are for it. All the faith community, Roman Catholics, Jews, Jewish organizations, are for comprehensive immigration reform because they see it as reasonable and necessary. And in addition to that, 70% of the American people, so it's not just organizations, it's the people are for it. And as I pointed out in my speech, it not only makes moral sense, not only makes practical common sense, but it also makes economic sense. And therefore, we're going to continue to push very hard for comprehensive immigration reform. Unfortunately, when Speaker Boehner put forth some 5 principles, you saw the reaction of the President, of the Democratic leadership on both the House and the Senate, as seeing that as a positive step. We welcomed those principles. That didn't mean we agreed with every one of them, but it did mean that we thought that there was a basis for positive, constructive discussion and movement forward on a comprehensive immigration reform bill. Unfortunately, 6 days later, as you know, Speaker Boehner, as the result of the opposition of so much of the conservative wing of his party to immigration reform, in effect said, we're not moving forward.
So grim, in other words. Let's move to Carmel. Maybe you could talk to me a little bit about CAP's view on this Social Security debate and the whole philosophy that Mr. Hoyer was talking about and that Bill Clinton's been talking about for many years about liberals having to show fiscal responsibility to prove that government can be trusted and to free up resources for programs that they would like. I mean, is that, where does CAP fit into that?
Well, I mean, I think we agree with that. In the 2012 report that Congressman cited, we had a plan that would get at a long-term deal that was a combination of spending cuts, revenues, increased revenues. I think I would take issue with Jim in that I don't think entitlements are our Achilles heel. I think they're vital programs that the American people care deeply about. Our safety net isn't sufficient, so we need to acknowledge that and look for ways, as Senator Warren has been doing, to try to fill the gaps. I do think in the end, we are going to have to figure out how we make that program more fiscally sustainable. But I think progressives in Congress and the president have shown a lot of courage in that regard, but they've got nobody to talk to, as I think Third Way has said. There's no table to bring the discussion to. But I think that progressives across the spectrum have shown that they're willing to be reasonable and find ways to make these programs sustainable. But we should be able to talk about how to also expand them where expansion is necessary, as we did in the context of ACA. Medicare wasn't enough in terms of health care coverage. And in the context of retirement, Social Security isn't going to be sufficient for many Americans. And I think what we need to do is start calling attention to the fact that we need policies that are about the majority of Americans and not the top 1%. We've got a recovery where 95% of the benefits of the recent recovery went to the top 1%. As progressives, we need to keep talking about that and saying we need to flip that. So it's 95% of the benefits are going to 99% of the people instead of the 1%. And I think that's where we should be looking for ways to make these programs work better.
Let me make a comment. Fiscal responsibility does not equate with letting down the most vulnerable in America. It does not equate with letting down those seniors who need the assistance that Social Security provides and that floor that it provides, or Medicare or Medicaid. America is too rich a country to ask its vulnerable and its poor to pay the price of fiscal balance. We don't need to do that. But we do need to have some rational policies which are math problems, not philosophical problems. That's what you're talking about in terms of the demographics. This is not philosophically whether you're for making sure that poor people in America or people who need help or who have invested in their Social Security and their Medicare over the years, we ought not to let them down. But we can get on a fiscally sustainable path without doing that. So I don't think it's an either-or situation. And I think that we ought to make sure that those who rely on Social Security are not fearful that fiscal responsibility will mean letting them down. If it does so, we're not the great country I think we are.
Do you have a real quick comment on that, Jim?
Well, I agree with that. I mean, look, I don't think that the entitlements are our Achilles heel. We're Democrats. We're proud of these entitlement programs. Our fear is that we're at the point where, you look over the next 20 years, the number of people over the age of 65, they're going to increase by 80%, and the number of people between the ages of 25 and 64, 8%. So, and then you look at the flat wages that are happening with a lot of the working class, and you're saying like, okay, you're 26 years old, you're going to have flat wages maybe for the next 10 or 15 years. Let me just put a little bit more burden on your back. And I do believe, I agree with the congressman, it's a false choice to say, well, we can't reform entitlements and, at the same time protect people who are vulnerable and elderly. But if you look at, in the most recent IRS statistics, 1 out of 9 senior citizens was earning more than $100,000. And, there are some people who are, there's a lot of people in this room that when they're senior citizens, they're going to be doing really well. And I think, can we do something in which we're giving some folks a bit of a haircut so we have some fiscal sustainability, but also that we're really investing enough in the next generation and in the next level of research, because that's really where our growth is going to come from.
Okay, and that's a great segue to the people in this room who are
Okay.
going to be doing so
Who I just
well in the
insulted.
future. Yeah, right. So who has a
Can I
question?
make one point before you go to the pay-go? It was mentioned, Matt mentioned in his introduction. We didn't pay for the tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. We're paying for them now.
Yep.
And the most vulnerable in America are paying for them, and children are paying for them. Because in 01 and 03, we didn't have, in my opinion, the common sense and good sense to pay for them. The proposition that somehow you don't need to pay for tax cuts, which Greenspan argued, he has since recanted that premise, that they don't pay for themselves. Now, either we're going to pay for them or our children and grandchildren are going to pay for them. And that really is about fiscal sustainability and fiscal responsibility. That's at the core of it.
Questions, anyone? No questions?
I just have a question about I'm sorry, my question is, when you talk about investments, you couch it in terms of the percentage of the federal budget. But what about in terms of dollar amounts over time, adjusted for inflation compared to the 1960s? Is that increased over time? I mean, I'm just curious about the overall level, not the percentage of the budget, but and the dollar amount, or say, for example, a per capita amount of spending, rather than just the percentage of the federal. I mean, maybe we're spending a lot more, it's just a smaller percentage of the federal budget. I'm just trying to get a feel that way for it.
Me? If you're talking about in real terms, it's down. It's down in research, it's down in basic biomedical research. It's down. And as I pointed out, the percentage we spend on investments, that is discretionary dollars, has flipped. Now it's flipped in part because in the 60s, of course, we adopted Medicare, which is a wonderful program, which I support, which is absolutely essential for our people. I want to make that clear that this is not about trading off those programs that have taken millions and millions and millions of Americans out of poverty, out of dependence, into independence and a better quality of life. But we are spending, in terms of our resources that we have available to us, a significantly less percentage on basic investments in growing our economy. And I think that's what Cap's talking about. We need to reverse that. And I certainly agree with Cap on that.
Yeah,
We're spending more, excuse me, Jim, go ahead.
I mean, look, theoretically, you could be spending more, but just remember that in 1965, our population was half the size that it was. I mean, you got to, we're a bigger country than we were. But if you look at it as a percentage of GDP, as the size of our economy, we're at an all-time low, post World War II, and you look at state budgets as well. We had a blip during the stimulus where we were heading down, and then we had a couple of years where it popped up for a little bit, but then it's back down to its declining share.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Hoyer. David Lauder with Reuters News Service. In the past, we've been talking about the grand bargain being something on the order of $4 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. Where do you think that number is now, and how much getting there will it be more than half revenue increases in your view?
Look, I don't think it's a number that I have in my head as to where it can go. Again, I think this is a math problem which is very much related to a human value problem, which is obligation, let me say that. But a math problem in this sense, it's not a number that I would pick out. It is a number that America will look at, business will look at, the rest of the world will look at. America's on a sustainable path, and it will not have to have a crisis of shutting down its government, of deciding whether it's going to pay its debt. That's the number over term. And when I pointed out in Bowles-Simpson, what Bowles-Simpson said in the early term, now they were talking some years ago, they were talking about the first 2 years or so of their program. We needed to invest to grow the economy. The economy has not grown as fast as we would have liked it to have grown, or that it needs to grow to create the kinds of jobs that our people need, and the kind of quality of life that we need, and the kind of revenues the federal government needs. The growth in the economy is the best budget solution. But so it's not a number, it is a plan which in fact people will say and have confidence will in fact get you from where we are today to a fiscally sustainable 3% or less of GDP deficits.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. The president left out the chain CPI proposal in his budget. Is that something that you think we ought to look at in order to get Social Security and Medicare on a sustainable path?
The press asks me that question all the time. I say everything needs to be on the table. The president left it out this time. Why? Because he got no response. He met with some senators last year, or maybe it was 2012, had a long discussion, said, look, okay, I'm serious. I'm going to put something on the table, something that I don't like. To show my bona fides. He put it on the table. along with other suggestions in his budget. He got no response. He got no positive, so okay, you put that on the table, we'll put this on the table. Everything needs to be on the table. There needs to be honest judgment, and we need to get to a place where both Democrats and Republicans can say, yes, there's some things in this we don't like. There's some things we would not do. But in my view, and I've said this a lot, there would be 15% on either side unhappy, and 70% of Americans would say, thank heavens they did it. The perfect example of that is Social Security, Ronald Reagan, and Tip O'Neill. Social Security was not on a sustainable path. They said it needed to be on a sustainable path. We got some more revenues for Social Security, which Ronald Reagan perhaps did not like. We got some restraints, we increased it from 65 to 67 in terms of benefits. That was a net reduction in benefits. You can look at it that way. And the fact is that the American people said, well, if Mr. Reagan and Mr. O'Neill thinks that's what we need to do, I think that's what we need to do. And we did, in fact, make Social Security sustainable for another 50 years from that 1983 deal. I think that's the model that we need to follow.
Hi, Robert Schlesinger with U.S. News and World Report. You mentioned the ACA in your speech as one of the things helping the deficit. One of the big milestones for it comes at the end of the month when the deadline for people enrolling passes. How should people judge the success or failure of the law as we pass that milestone?
Well, I think millions and millions of people are signing up. I think because accelerated greatly over the last few weeks. As usually happens when you have a deadline, all of us say, oh, we got to file our taxes, it's April 15th. So in this case, we need to sign up. I think, and I've said this throughout the country, I think the American people are going to view the Affordable Care Act as a significant success. I have people coming up to me all the time that said, I didn't have insurance, I now can get it because I had a pre-existing condition. We talk about that a lot, but there are other aspects of it as well that are very positive for seniors, for young people, and for citizens generally. Not only is I think it going to be economically achieve the goals of saving money, but I also think it will make a healthier America. So from that standpoint, I think it's going to be a political benefit in the longer run. The rollout was terrible. We all recognize that. The president recognizes that. Maryland had one of the worst rollouts. We're getting to that. We're fixing that. And I was with the Lieutenant Governor yesterday. I think we're going to exceed our goals in terms of sign-ups, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 plus. So I think it's going to be a net plus, and I think it will be, from both standpoints, making a healthier America, a fairer America, and I think it's going to be an economic benefit as well.
A political benefit in the longer run, what about in the, say, next 9 months?
You can't solve America's problems in 24-month segments. You heard me say that. I think the American people in the next 6 months are going to see and hear an awful lot of stories about the success of the Affordable Care Act. They've been hearing a lot of bad stories, but not so recently. Not so recently. It's getting better and better, and I think by November, Americans are going to say, well, you know, there were some glitches here and there, but on the whole, this is good. My kids got insurance, and my child who had a pre-existing condition got insurance. Seniors going to say, I'm saving money on my prescription drugs. People are going to say, I got really sick, I got a serious disease, and guess what? I wasn't capped either annually or lifetime in terms of benefits that I could receive. So I think net, people are going to say, this was a good thing, and we're glad that it happened. As a matter of fact, the most recent poll I read was 51%, 52% of Americans either liked the Affordable Care Act or don't think it went far enough. They wanted a public option. So the majority of folks in the last poll I saw, which I think was maybe a Pew poll, indicated that a majority said they either liked it or they wanted something to go further, i.e. a public option.
We have time for one more question. There's one in the back, and there's one over here, maybe. Go here.
Thank you. I'll try to project this. I'm also running the camera. Paul Corson with CNN. Thank you. Questions on the Ukraine and whether the IMF element of the legislation that's trying to come through Congress might have to be foregone with because of the urgency that's cranked up now.
Well, I'm for I think the administration is correct in proposing the IMF. I think the Senate is correct that the IMF ought to be included in this. It means more money to Ukraine, for one thing, $600 million additional dollars above the $1 billion. But if we can't get that passed, we ought to pass the $1 billion without the IMF because we need to move as quickly as we can to give confidence to the Ukrainian people and evidence to the Russians that we fully intend to make sure that Ukraine is a viable economic unit.
With the massing of the troops, do you sense that the urgency has really gotten to an edge?
I certainly think the massing of troops makes it more important that we act and act decisively and quickly, yes.
Okay, well, that's the end of our program. Thanks very much to our speaker and our panelists and to all of you for coming, and hope to see you again in a forum. Thank you.
Thank you.